Hello and welcome. I'm Dana Bibi of the programs team at the Columbia Global Center in Amman. Thank you for joining us today for a reading and conversation with Omar El Akkad. We're delighted to bring you a discussion of his second novel, What Strange Paradise. Omar is an author and journalist. He was born in Egypt, grew up in Qatar, moved to Canada as a teenager, and now lives in the United States. The start of his journalism career coincided with the start of the War on Terror. And over the following decade, he reported from Afghanistan, Guantanamo Bay, and many other locations around the world. His work earned a National Newspaper Award for Investigative Journalism and the Geoff Penny Award for Young Journalists. His fiction and nonfiction writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde, Guernica, GQ, and many other newspapers and magazines. His debut novel, American War, is an international bestseller and has been translated into 13 languages. It won 3 prizes and has been nominated for more than 10 other awards. It was listed as one of the best books of the year by the New York Times, Washington Post, GQ, and PR Esquire, and was selected by the BBC as one of 100 novels that changed our world. What Strange Paradise is Omar's second novel, and it was just awarded the 2021 Scotiabank Giller Prize, the richest in Canadian literature. It is also longlisted for the 2022 Aspen Words Literary Prize. This book has been lauded by the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Financial Times, The Guardian, NPR, Quill Enquirer, Oprah Daily, and many more publications. Omar's writing has been described as laced with hope and compassion, as it is searing, lyrical, and a beguiling parable of dispossessed peoples and the burning desire for home. The book has been labeled by reviewers as extraordinary, that it deserves to be an instant classic, and compared to the way novels like The Stranger or Mice and Men are, brief, coolly delivered, but with seas of emotion underneath. We're pleased to be involved and to have the opportunity to share this work with a broader audience. The global centers are hubs of Columbia University, currently in 9 cities around the world, that work with students, faculty, and regional partners to create opportunities for shared learning and research, and to deepen the nature of global dialogue on a range of issues. This book talk is our 5th in a series that features Arab authors to showcase some of the breadth and diversity in Arab fiction writing. What Strange Paradise is a deeply profound, vital story that humanizes the ongoing global refugee crisis. This gripping book is relevant and necessary today, as the number of displaced people is higher now than it has ever been due to conflict and climate change. According to the UN Higher Commissioner for Refugees, there are over 82.4 million forcibly displaced people in the world at the end of December 22, and this is double the figures from 2010. The UNHCR also state that children account for approximately half of all the world's refugees, a perhaps distant statistic that might be desensitized or inadequate to convey the stark reality and challenging implications for so many of our future generations. Omar's choice to empathetically position his narrative from the eyes of 2 children helps deliver a unique, unfolding reminder of our common humanity. What Strange Paradise is a page-turner with complex situations that will make you think hard about moral courage and difficult choices, about the psychology of home and safety, of good and evil, desperation, compassion, and hope. I would now like to hand over to Dr. Sukhdev Sandhu, our moderator for this conversation. Sukdev is an associate professor of English and Social and Cultural Analysis at New York University, where he also directs the Colloquium for Unpopular Culture and runs the Text und Ton imprint. He's also an author of Night Haunts, A Journey Through the London Night, which is the winner of the 2008 D.H. Lawrence International Prize for Travel Writing. He makes radio documentaries for the BBC and is a film critic, and he was named Critic of the Year at the British Press Awards in 2005. His writings have appeared in a number of publications, including the London Review of Books, Süddeutsche Zeitung, Du, The Wire, Sight and Sound, Bidun, Gastronomica, The Australian, New York, The Guardian, and more. Thank you again to everyone in our virtual audience for being with us. Please do send in your questions through the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen, and they will be addressed in this webinar. Now, please join me in welcoming Sukdev.
Thanks, Dana. Omar, it seems it might be a good idea for those of us here, wherever we are in Zoom life, in Zoom world, who haven't had an opportunity yet to read the novel, to get a flavor of a voice, get a sense of a kind of a mise en scène. And I think you had an extract you were thinking of kicking things off with.
Sure. I will start with, first of all, thank you so much for doing this, Professor. I really, really appreciate it. I know how much work goes into this sort of thing. And thank you, Dana, for that incredibly generous introduction. It was far more generous than I deserve. I think other than the fact that there are a few small animals who don't fare particularly well in my novel. I don't know what comparison points with Of Mice and Men, what other ones work, but I really appreciate that. That was very generous. I guess just to be a stone cold bummer, I will read from one of the most depressing parts of the. So this novel, What Strange Paradise, is a repurposed fable of sorts. It's a story of Peter Pan reinterpreted as a story of a contemporary child refugee. And it opens on a scene of a shipwreck. There's a migrant ship that has wrecked on the shore of an unnamed Western island. And there's a small boy named Amir, who is the sole survivor. And so from that moment, you know what has already happened. And then we sort of move back and forth between how this happened and what happened after the shipwreck. So I'm going to read the final before chapter, which is the scene of the shipwreck. This doesn't spoil anything. You sort of know what's going to happen. But this is the moment that this migrant ship finally goes under. In the last moments, some held on dearly, leaving splinters of nail and streaks of blood between the boards. And although earlier the boat was filled with screaming, of these remaining few, none made a sound. Others, knowing now what was about to happen, what was inevitable, gave in, and without resistance were swept off the deck and into the water, and they too made no sound. In the distance, the island, the colored lights, the music. One final time, the waves lifted the calypso high. Under the force of a tumbling body, the mast snapped at its base. The sea overwhelmed, drowning the bloom of limbs that struggled to escape the lower quarters. Turning past the point of rebound, the old fishing boat flung its last few occupants still hanging on to the far starboard side into the air. For an instant, the deck became perpendicular to the surface of the water, and then, like a closing eyelid, met it. Amir took flight, headlong into the seaborne sky, the roof of the great inverted world. In meeting him, the water was not cold or concussive, but warm and tranquil. Its temperature, the temperature of a body, the temperature of blood. With ease and without pain, he flew past the surface, past the depths, past the places where light and life surrendered and the domain of stillness began. And then lower, farther, past the crust of a million interlocking bodies who'd braved this passage before him and come to rest at the bottom, sick with the secrets of their own unallowed mourning. Past the smallest flower-white bones, past the world at the feet of the world, to the lowest deep, then a lower deep still, until finally to a dry womb of a place in which were kept safe and unchanging everyone he had ever known, and everyone each of those had ever known, outward forever to encompass the whole of the living and the lived. And each of these the boy met in their old lives and their new lives waiting, and from each drew confession, and each he felt into as though there were no barrier between them, no silo of self to keep a soul waiting. What beautiful rebellion to feel into another, to feel anything at all. And then he surfaced.
One of the phrases that we've already heard today and that we often hear, I don't know about you, Omar, but my mind goes a bit blank when I hear the phrase refugee crisis. It feels both accurate and kind of mystificatory, depending who we are or what our backgrounds are. We might wonder, have we ever lived in a world which wasn't undergoing a refugee crisis? The crisis is normalcy to us, which is another way, I guess, of asking you about time. We are surrounded by headlines. There's a profusion of images. It can be deadening sometimes as much as it's revelatory. In the kind of miasma of, as you would say, stone cold bummer stories, what was the starting point for you? Or did this novel have a kind of precise kind of beginning?
The closest thing I have to sort of Genesis moment was in 2012. This is a story I always go back to. That's one of the great privileges of making stuff up for a living, is that after the fact, you can create a very clean Genesis story. You know, this happened, and I wrote a book. In reality, these things are far, far messier than that. But the closest thing I have to a Genesis moment was in 2012. I was back in Egypt, which is where I was born, where I lived, where my family's all is. And I was covering the aftermath of the Arab Spring. I was still working full time as a journalist at the time. I was driving around with an old high school buddy who was complaining about the rent. You know, rent's too high, rent's too high. And at one point I asked, you know, well, what's the rent for an apartment in your building, for example? And he said, well, do you mean the locals price or do you mean the Syrians price? And so what the hell's the Syrians price? And he said, well, we've had this influx of people come in and you can charge them 3 times as much. I mean, what are they going to do? Go somewhere else? And it became clear that this wasn't just apartments. This was when you went down to buy fruits and vegetables from the stall, and you know the guy heard the accent and immediately put 2 and 2 together. And just the casualness, I think, of that cruelty got me thinking about not just the act in of itself and the exploitation in of itself, but how much of a load-bearing societal beam that had become. Which is to say, not that it was an aberration, but it was actually a central function of the kind of societies we've created. I grew up in Qatar. I grew up from the age of 5 to 16. I lived in Doha. And I remember the last time I went to visit, I landed at the airport and I was walking out and there were these Nepalese guys who had basically been penned into what appeared to be like a makeshift cell, like an open air kind of like, don't leave this space. And my buddy Ramsey came to pick me up and I said, what the hell is going on over there? This isn't something that I've seen at an airport before. And he said, the sheikh who hired these folks to come in to do manual labor of some kind or another decided while they were in the air to revoke his sponsorship. He decided he didn't need them anymore. So they arrived. Anyone who knows anything about the Gulf countries, you show up, you have a sponsor. That's the reason you're allowed to work. They were now nowhere people, right? And so they were waiting on, I don't know what embassy, the Nepalese embassy, to sort of figure this out. But in the meantime, they were nowhere people. They did not exist in any kind of sense that had any relationship with agency. And so these were the things I was thinking about when I was putting this book together, is to try and dwell on someone who is fodder for that kind of world and that kind of exploitation. This is when I have to awkwardly tell you you're muted.
Yeah. Could you talk a bit more about your background? You mentioned Cairo, Qatar, Canada, many other places. This early worlding that you had, these early experiences of movement, of different kinds of precarity, of migration. I don't know if I'm overly dramatizing them, but how has that kind of informed your adult and writerly trajectory?
Yeah, so I think, the short answer is that it's informed every facet of it, all of my stories, the novels, the short stories, that element of feeling unanchored. I was born in one place, but I left when I was 5. I grew up in another place, but I could never go back and become a citizen. I'm now a citizen of both Canada and the US, but I didn't come to North America until I was 16. My name's Omar, but it's not really Omar. It's Omar Muhammad Al-Akkad. It should be El Akkad, but because I'm Egyptian, it's like being from South Boston, the accent, everybody knows you're Egyptian from like within 3 words. All of that stuff, growing up in Qatar, 90% of the population is from somewhere else. And so you're in this mix. My best friends were a Somali guy, a Pakistani guy, an Italian guy, but you're also growing up on imported culture. Sort of, we had Qatar 1 and we had Qatar 2. This is before cable or internet. Qatar 1 was Arabic, Qatar 2 was English. They imported 2 shows from the United States for reasons that I cannot decipher. It was MacGyver and America's Most Wanted. Again, I don't know why, but I grew up watching these shows, and I had a very particular image of America as a very resourceful, very violent place as a result, which, not far off, I guess. When I was about 4, my dad had to get out of Egypt. The economic and political situation had gotten really bad, and he got a job offer in Libya. And so we're at the airport, and my dad's name is Muhammad Ahmed Al Akkad. Muhammad Ahmed happens to be a very common combination of names. There's a Muhammad Ahmed on the terrorism watch list. We get called into secondary. We miss the flight. The job offer is revoked. A little while later, he ends up getting a job offer in Qatar, which ends up becoming pound for pound the richest place on earth. So the entire trajectory of my life, the reason I sound the way I do, the reason I can write in this language, so on and so forth, it was a coin flip at an airport before I had any say in the matter. And so that has marked everything I've written. And it's a jarring experience because the writers I most admire are people who had the exact opposite experience. When I think of someone like Naguib Mahfouz, who marinated in Egypt. I mean, he could write the hell out of Egypt because he knew the place in and out. Toni Morrison, even James Agee, who went down to the South and kind of marinated there to write Let Us Praise Famous Men, which was the book that influenced me the most when I was writing American War. All these people had the place down, and I don't. I don't have any place down. I write the opposite kind of fiction, for better or worse. It's very, very unanchored.
So how do you train your eyes, or how have your eyes become sort of trained to mapping and memorializing these sort of shifting geographies over the years? And how do you keep your eyes and your ears fresh?
That's a really fascinating question. I think a lot of it has to do with a kind of what's the word for when your senses bleed into one another? Is it synesthesia?
Yeah, synesthesia.
Yeah, synesthesia. That's it. But a topographical one as opposed to a sensory one. What I mean by that is that I have a natural disrespect for the nation state as an entity. And so one of the first things I do in almost every story I write is I move borders around. And I this bleeds into geography. In American War, I drowned out the East Coast and I put Florida underwater. And for What Strange Paradise, half the chapters take place on the eastern edge of Crete, but it's never mentioned. I took all the flora and fauna and replaced it with fantastical birds and beasts and so on and so forth. And that, what I replace the sort of hard borders with is relationships. Almost all my memory is relational. Like for me, I don't mean any disrespect to Qatar as a place, but for me, Qatar is just the site where a bunch of relationships happened. Like when I go back there now, I can barely recognize the place. My father worked at the Sheraton, which in the mid-90s was the only luxury hotel in town. And now if you walk down the Corniche, it's this dinky little thing next to the Four Seasons, which is like 50 stories, and next to this, and the place I lived, ironically called El Defna, which means, I guess, the area that has been graveyarded, or the burial, because they reclaimed the sea, has now itself been graveyarded by luxury hotels and skyscrapers and whatnot. And so any attempt to superimpose the contours of my life on a geography or a place inevitably fail. And so I revert very much to memory and relationships. That's where I go. And it's not so much, it doesn't create better fiction. If anything, it creates worse fiction, but it's the only way that I know how to relate the experiences as I live them.
Yeah, I was struck so many times reading a novel by the laser sharp precision of details, especially, of course, in the extended sequences at sea. Just the detonation of smell, details about a packet of Tic Tacs, I mean, the crude way of describing that is it's journalistic. There are many different kinds of journalism, and not all journalists pay attention to tic-tacs. Could you talk about how you created this effect, this really quite stunning effect of verisimilitude in so many sections of the book?
Well, thank you. First of all, that's very generous. I think, unfortunately, part of it is journalistic. Is it's crudely journalistic. 10 years as a journalist is going to sort of beat that into you. I mean, for lack of a better phrase, I steal from everywhere. I steal in the journalistic sense, the research. I have the books lying back here, the various sort of. Usually, I don't like books that are written in the middle of an event. The most overt example is the Trump years. All of the books about Trump that came out in the Trump years sold 1 million copies in the first week, and then everybody realized that this was, pretty trashy sort of stuff. But in the case of what I was writing about, I was looking for books that were written in the moment, and for all their flaws, I didn't want the benefit of the sort of hindsight and the long-term view. I wanted the immediacy. And so some of the details are stolen from those books. There's a lot of literary stealing. The section I read alone steals from the Odyssey and Paradise Lost. And there's a ton of Peter Pan and J.M. Barrie's. There's, the books of the Apocrypha, and particularly the Book of Nicodemus is a huge structural influence. And depending on how familiar readers are with An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, that short story, this is a very different book. It reads very differently depending on readers' familiarity with that. So there's a lot of factual journalistic stealing, there's a lot of literary stealing, and then there's a lot of personal stealing from my own experiences. So the central relationship in the book is between two children who don't speak the same language. And so they're constantly doing things like, I'm 15, how old are you? And the sort of, that kind of thing. That was stuff we did back in Qatar. You'd be on the beach playing, you'd see another kid, you'd naturally want to form a friendship, and you would just assume off the bat that this person didn't speak your language. And so you would come up with that kind of makeshift thing. I'm a sucker for line level, anything that's happening at the line level. You give me the worst, least believable plot, no factual accuracy. I'm a sucker for that line level beauty of writing, beauty of detail. And what you get in most of my writing is just a very pale attempt of me trying to do that same kind of line level stuff that's in the books I love.
You mentioned Peter Pan. Could you talk about how can I phrase this? There's a certain imperative that one sometimes hears for the importance of eyewitness reports, of reportage, of documentary, of fidelity, all of that stuff. And this is obviously very important. It might strike some people as surprising that you would lean on a very different kind of storytelling, J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. Could you talk about why that seemed important to you to infuse this narrative with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think part of it is that there was an element of, you write fiction and you think of fiction as having, as sort of, the fiction's purpose is to intrude on reality. And then you find yourself living in a world where reality is frequently intruding on the fictional. Virtually everything that happened over the past 5-6 years, if I had thought of it a decade earlier and tried to put it into a novel, it probably would have been rejected for being too fantastical, too out there. And in fact, I had this problem with American War, which sort of envisioned a second civil war. And one of the real sources of pushback was this is cartoonishly out of touch with the book ends up coming out 4 months into the Trump administration, and it's read in a very different way than I intended it, precisely because it had the opposite problem. To me, I thought that I was writing a book that took place at the collision point of two fantasies. One headed in one direction that said, everyone coming here from over there is a barbarian at the gate, and we need to build better gates. And even if we need to burn down our own end of things to keep them out, then that's worth it. The fantasy headed in the other direction being, if I can just make it over there, everything will be okay. Now, those are two gross oversimplifications, but I very much wanted to write a book that took place where those two fantasies meet.
Yeah.
And I wanted to take a comforting fairy tale that Westerners had been telling their kids for the better part of 100 years, and I wanted to invert it. J.M. Barrie, who was the most famous playwright in the world, I think, in his heyday, when he was a kid, his older brother died in a skating accident. He was only 13, I think, and it crushed the family. His mom never recovered. One of the things that his mom said to herself in order to sort of try to comfort herself is, well, at least he's never going to grow old. And so the origins of Peter Pan are an inversion of when you think about Peter Pan syndrome, the man who refuses to stop acting like a child. The origins of Peter Pan are the exact opposite. It's the child who never gets a chance to become a man. And so for all those reasons, it seemed a fitting construction. There's no kind of overt Peter Panish, details in the book. You really need to know the thing down before they start to pop up. But that was my sort of intent when I went into it.
Yeah, as I was reading it, I was recalling also the book about the Wizard of Oz that Salman Rushdie once wrote, and he said, this film is in a sense a global film. Everybody's believing that there's somewhere over, this is the refugees, this is the would-be exiles narrative of all narratives. We want to move from a world of black and white into color. We want to believe there is an elsewhere. We also know that there's literally no place like home. We cannot go back. Everything has turned into rubble or a mini Sheraton, as you were describing. You have written in a range of publications before. You've written an introduction to a kind of a graphic treatment of stories or narratives about Guantanamo Bay, contributed a story to Victor Laval's collection of speculative fiction about contemporary USA. What for you are you frustrated by the limits of kind of realism and realistic fiction?
One of the funny things about that Victor Laval anthology is that they send me the email and I'm just an astoundingly lazy human being. So I read the first part of this email, which was, we're putting together an anthology. Imagine decades more of Trump-like rule, the United States in decline, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, sure, I can imagine that. No worries, I'll write you a short. And I wrote the short story and handed it in. And then years later, as I was going through my email, read the rest of the second paragraph, which said, so we're looking for hopeful alternatives to this sort of thing. And by then it was far too late in the game to do anything about the incredibly depressing story that I had submitted to this anthology. I go to places where my deficiencies aren't so glaring. This goes back to the notion of, if you go read the Cairo trilogy, right? Mahfouz's most famous work, right? That's a person who has walked the terrain by foot. You can tell every book's a map and you can tell what kind of map maker is responsible. You can tell if they've walked the terrain by foot or if they flew over it from 30,000 feet or if they've just pulled Google satellite imagery and based their, you can tell real quick that this is a person who mapped this by foot. And I don't have access to that, just from a natural experience point of view. And so one of the things I tend to try to do is start from a premise that renders that deficiency a little less of a hindrance. So my favorite short story that I ever wrote, I've written a lot of really bad short stories. I've written one or two good short stories. And this one I wrote was based on this idea that there is this metal, this newly discovered metal. They found out that if you create an enclosure out of it and put something inside and mark it with the DNA of the person who owns it, the moment that person dies, the box, whatever's inside disappears. And it's assumed that that thing then follows the person to the afterlife. Fast forward there's now like the same way you go to the post office, every citizen is granted a little box. And so there's this giant government building. And the whole point was to think, if that construct was available, what would you put in your afterlife box? And so the whole story is full of people who have like, their pocket edition of War and Peace, or like a resume, or gold, or a gun, or what, and I love starting from those kinds of premises and using them as a way to kind of even the ground, so that I'm not constantly being faced with the fact that I've never spent enough time in one particular place to become the kind of writers who I adore.
Talking about unhappy endings or stone cold bummers, I can't get that phrase out of my head now. I couldn't help but think while I was reading this book that oftentimes the voyages, the journeys of people from the underdeveloped world or the aspiring world to the overdeveloped world are seen as journeys from vulnerability and precarity to some degree of stability. But throughout this book, I had this very keen sense that we were all sinking, we were all capsized, and that even the island itself seemed incredibly fragile and precarious, that itself was kind of drowning. Am I sort of deluded in this sense of an incredible atmospheric vulnerability that kind of permeates almost every page of this book?
Yeah, I mean, The Boy is Jesus and We All Killed Him would have made for a very different title than What Strange Paradise. It probably would have had a harder time getting that one past the good people at Knopf. It is thoroughly pointless and an insult to be saying this sort of thing to a professor who understands this stuff far better than I do, but I was fascinated by the traditional comedy structure, which is so many of the stories in the Bible have a traditional comedic structure, that U-shape, right? Everything was good, everybody lost faith in the Lord, things got really bad, they regained their faith, the Lord made it better again, right? The divine comedy, the sort of comedic shape. And after a while, it occurred to me that regardless the quality of it, I was operating with this before and after in a very sort of Old Testament, New Testament kind of back and forth. You have a set of chapters that are concerned with a miraculous rebirth, and you have a set of chapters that are concerned with an exodus from Egypt. And I was going back and forth between those. And the central thing I wanted to do was take the privilege of hopefulness as a default, and the assumption that everything will work out in the end as a default, and use it as a trap to spring on the reader. And that is one of those things that overwhelmingly fails more than it succeeds, because it depends entirely on the mindset of the reader. So I've gotten, the first 4 people to read this manuscript had 4 entirely different interpretations of what the hell was going on in the book. And since that time, the interpretations have been very much just a fascinating window into the worldview of the person who has that interpretation. I got an email from somebody recently who said, "Thank you so much for ending it the way that you did, with the person helping another child off the shore and pushing the chain out of the way so that they can help." And I thought, I hope there's more people like you in the world, I guess, who have this fundamentally. But my God, what a privilege to have that kind of worldview. I think it's a very sort of, it's a very different book in terms of its indictment, the scope of its indictment based on the reader.
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't been published for so long, but do you have a sense that people's reactions hinge in part about where they are in the world?
Yeah, that's been overwhelmingly the case. And I think this is actually one of those parts where my Arabness, whatever that means, comes into play a lot more than in other aspects of the work. So With American War, for example, there's a section in American War which is the most brutal. It's a fairly brutal book, but there's a section that involves a massacre in a refugee camp. And that's very much based on a real thing that happened in Sabra and Shatia 40 years ago, a massacre of Palestinian refugees. And, the camp in the book is called Camp Patience. Patience, the Arabic word is Sabr, Sabra and Shatia, and so on and so forth. Nobody in North America, virtually nobody in North America got that reference. And one of the questions I would get overwhelmingly in North America about that section is, why did you make it so brutal? Why did you make it so ugly? And then I was doing a virtual book club with a group in Cairo who immediately got the reference. And their first question was, well, if this is based on Sabra and Shatia, why did you tone it down so much? There's an entirely different prism through which this thing was being read. And What Strange Paradise doesn't do that as much on a macro level, but it does it a ton on a micro level. So for example, at the beginning of the book, Vanna, the character who lives on the island, this is a sort of tourist trappy kind of place, lots of resorts. And one of the nightclubs is playing this rap song that she can't stand. And it's never sort of explicitly stated, but if you read between the lines, the description of the song, it's Big Pimpin' by Jay-Z. Fast forward to the other side of the book, the ship is closing in on the island and somebody hears music and they say, listen, they're playing our song. These are our people. And that's because Big Pimpin' uses a sample from an Egyptian song called Khusara Khusara. The number of people whose cultural knowledge base includes the back catalog of Jay-Z and mid 20th century Egyptian pop is me and 3 other people, right? Like it's not the biggest sort of demographic, but I very deliberately decided that whatever of my Arabness I wanted to put in this book, I was going to put into this book. Whatever of my Westernness I wanted to put in, I was going to put in. And if I lost readership as a result, or if people didn't see the thing I was trying to do, so be it. In that sense, I was very much taking a page out of one of my recent literary heroes, Preti Taneja, who wrote We That Are Young, which is basically King Lear in modern corporate India. It's like Succession, but it's set in this multinational based in, and she does not give a damn if you don't follow. His characters are going to break into Hindi slang, they're going to do this, they're going to do that, and she doesn't care in the slightest. She's on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum is like, Inshallah, he said, invoking the Arabic phrase meaning God willing, like that kind of thing. And so I was trying to go to her neighborhood. For better or worse, that's where I wanted to be.
Yeah, I'm going to try to paraphrase a question from Ashraf. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly. Ashraf Abu Faris. Thank you. Ashraf asks me to thank you for such an illuminating, interesting talk. Do you think your novel situates its characters in relation to identity and belonging? And did you intend to foreground a certain definition or outlook about the concept of home or of homeland in the novel?
So that's a fascinating question. Thank you for that. I'm not so much concerned with identity as I am with the privilege of deciding what gets to count as an identity and what doesn't, which somewhat subtle distinction, but the United States, where I currently live, is full of identity politics, and the vast majority of it is white people identity politics. It just never gets called that when you're considered the default. And so I'm fascinated by that idea of what gets to count as identity. I'm a brown Muslim guy living in America. When I look at the most sort of mass culture interpretations of people who look like me, who share my identity traits, you look at Hollywood and you're down to three people, right? You're either the bad guy who's a terrorist, you're the good guy who helps Jack Bauer catch the terrorist, or you're a fruit and vegetable vendor whose stall gets destroyed in a Matt Damon car chase. That's it. That's sort of 90% of interpretations right there. And my knee-jerk reaction when I go to write people who share my identity traits is I'm going to offset all of that. I individually am going to offset this systemic misinterpretation of my people by making my characters pure as the driven snow, and they, by virtue of just how good they are going to undo all of this damage, which is nonsense. You don't undo individually a systemic issue. And I have to fight against that, and I have to tell myself, no, I want my characters to be flawed, and I want them to be broken in ways that match the ways I want to explore. So I have to fight against that on the identity front. Basically trying to explain the entire spectrum of the experience, every possible experience of being a brown person, every possible experience of being a Muslim. You get this sort of Atlas syndrome where you're like, I'm going to have to carry the entirety of the world on my back. You don't. The reason you feel you have to do that is because of a systemic issue. And the other side of it is not trying to make all of my characters part of a mission statement to offset the negative interpretations of my people, So that's on the identity front. On the homeland front, I'm very much, with this book specifically, I'm very much concerned with identity, home as a function of agency and luck. So I talked earlier about that coin flip moment at the airport that determined the entirety of the rest of my life. I'm obsessed with moments like that and what they mean for the idea of home. Because I've never felt much of agency, even later on when I became a grown-up who could decide where he lived. There was always that element of being swept up in a certain kind of current. And instead of hoping for shore, turning the act of swimming into home. And so for me, home has been the swimming rather than the shore.
Is there something that children can know or can access that is lost on adults?
And I think a lot of my readers get angry at me because I think a lot of people don't like the way I write children. I may be a very bad writer of children, but I gravitate to that place all of the time. Both my novels start out with childhood. In the case of What's Strange Paradise, they end up in childhood as well. I think it's the site of our only real honest interaction with the world before the various sort of compelling forces of late stage capitalism and all the ordering of the world and, the lies we have to tell ourselves to just get through the day kind of thing. Before any of that kicks in, I think there's a fundamental honesty to the interactions that children have with the world. And because I'm drawn to writing almost exclusively about the things that make me angry, and those things happen to be systemic, and the systems are very much fraudulent at their core. They rely on lies. And as a result, I tend to collide them with the honesty of childhood as a way to kind of expose that to the best of my ability. None of that means that I write children well, but it's magnetic for me to go to the place that feels like the opposite mission statement of living than the society we've created and all the sort of compelling forces that are in it.
Yeah, I like your insistence on anger as writing out of anger, writing in anger, thinking of anger as an energy. While reading the book, I kept on going back to that quote from Kafka, who spoke about the need for artists to take an axe to the frozen heart, to the frozen sea in people's hearts. You have to keep doing it. But it makes me wonder what you want, to the extent that you know, or you want to articulate it, what you want from the reader. Oftentimes with stories about refugees, it's about connection, it's about empathy. Sometimes they are about offering a kind of social X-ray. Is it to induce rage?
I mean, if it induces anything at all, then I consider that a win. I remember reading this interview with Baldwin, James Baldwin, toward it's sort of middle of his life when he was in France. And the interviewer just coming in with this mindset of, what an amazing literary adventure to be in France, and how fantastic this must be for you, and inspiring. And Baldwin trying to explain, no, I had to get out of the United States because I would have been killed. I was too angry to be a Black man in the United States. They would have killed me. an entirely sort of different interpretation of the situation that he was in. You know, those writers have the thing I don't, the thing I'm constantly reaching for, which is this very profound alchemy where you can take the fire and you can use it to make something constructive without letting it burn the whole place down. And I don't quite have that. In both my books and a lot of my stories, you can see the scorch marks on the walls, the places where it got away from me, where the fire overtook my ability to keep it in control. But I'm constantly reaching for that place. In terms of what I want from the reader, I used to have a much more certain answer to that, particularly when I was writing American War. I thought, you know, this is going to change everybody's mind about everything. Neoliberalism, this is the stunning indictment of neoliberalism. The West is no longer going to bomb brown people after this, you know. And then I remember getting, Knopf sent me a list of indie bookseller blurbs or reaction quotes to the book. I don't know why they sent it to me. Not all of them were good. But one of them was from an indie bookseller in Texas that just said, you know, American War shows why a second Civil War would be brutal and bloody and why it is necessary. And I thought, oh, that's what you took from this. You thought I was calling for a second American Civil War. So I've learned that it doesn't belong to me the second it goes out into the world. I think of these things generally, you know, every story as being a kind of elegy for the person you were when you wrote it. And this is particularly the case with novels, which take, you know, a much longer time to put together. The person I was when I wrote both these books no longer exists. And so I think if I can ask for anything from the reader, I hope that the act of reading it becomes a little bit of an elegy for even the tiniest bit of the person they used to be before they read it. Beyond that, I have no, I've lost that sense of like, oh, this is going to solve the refugee crisis. I think that's gone out the window.
We have a number of questions in chat. How did publishing your first novel change how you approached writing the second?
When I was writing American War, I was still working as a journalist full-time. So I was writing mostly between the hours of midnight and 4 a.m., which is a horrible way to live. I don't recommend it, but it's the only way I could do what I did. But I didn't have a publisher, didn't have an agent, didn't have an expectation this thing would ever see the light of day. And there was an incredible lightness amidst all the anxiety of trying to write a book. There was an incredible lightness that I didn't realize until after the fact. With What Strange Paradise, I was so often hobbled by this notion of, oh, what will people who like the world building and the speculative aspect of American War, what will they think about this very different book in that sense? What will my publisher think? What will this, you know? And all of that was wasted brain power. That's effort I should have been exerting on behalf of the text. And that was difficult. That made the process much more difficult. And I don't know what I could have done differently. But I was terrified. It's not like American War sold millions of copies. And it wasn't J.K. Rowling over here worrying about, you know, what people are going to think about what I've done to Harry Potter. That's not. It was just, I have this tiny career, and do I really want to sabotage it with, or what little there is of it, with a hard right turn? So that was a huge influence on me. And the other thing is that I have sort of these anxieties. The central voice in my head is one of insecurity. And so while I was writing American War, that voice was saying, what are you doing? You have so few hours where you're not being paid to write, and you're using the write a thing that will never see the light of day. Like, why are you doing this? And once it came out and it didn't do too badly, the voice switched to, oh, you're a one-hit wonder. You'll never do this again. And then when this, you know, like it finds new ways. And so that voice is very much tied to, it's this incredibly self-defeating way to take whatever little portion of success you've had and turn it into a negative thing. Like, oh, it's all downhill from here. That's the relationship. I'm trying to fix it, but I'm having trouble.
I like your self-flagellatory tone, Omar.
At least somebody likes it.
Yeah. Another question. Did you know the ending of What Strange Paradise before you started writing it?
The only things I knew when I started writing was the opening paragraph and the closing paragraph. So yes, I knew how I wanted to open the novel, and I knew how I wanted to end the novel. Everything in between was a blur.
Mm.
And the second last chapter, sort of the stuff that comes right before the final moment of the book, that changed a lot. So there was a version of this where Bana and Amir find their way through Germany up to Sweden, and you see a sweep of the rest of their lives. They grow old together, much like Peter, the kid that Peter Pan was based on. That kid went on to start his own indie publishing company. Amir starts his own, for refugee literature and so on and so forth. So that changed quite a bit. But the opening scene, the closing scene, were welded to the text from the moment I started.
Yeah. Have you been following the art project of Little Amal, the what's it, for 3.5 meter high puppet, who's traveled from the Turkish-Syrian border, I think, up to north of the UK, and it's become a kind of Rorschach test on people around him, people throwing stones, people hugging him, meeting the Pope.
The first thing I was going to do was ask you, what do you think of that project, precisely because I'm interested in that Rorschach test element of it.
Yeah, I read one description saying that it doesn't look like a cute child, it looks like an angry lefty. And I've read criticism saying, well, of course, this is so cutesy, it's just a child, but most refugees are men, and they're bad people, many of them, and all of that, maybe all that's kind of sort of predictable. I don't know. I would love to have been present at some point, to be surprised by joy, to be perplexed, as you say, when you produce a novel, you let it go out in the world, you don't know what's going to happen. And similarly with something like this, I wonder what the reactions would be if a sort of similar kind of giant puppet were to move from coast to coast or into the inland empire of America.
Yeah, it amazes me how quickly I turn fully Machiavellian when it comes to issues like this. Because there's a part of me that thinks, oh, this is performative. This is centering somebody else's attempt to be a good person ahead of the issue, so on and so forth. But if it changes one mind, use all the giant puppets you want, because I also think of it in terms of my own work, right? If it doesn't change minds, then it's purely performative, I guess. So I turn real Machiavellian in a hurry when it comes to projects like this.
Okay, a couple of questions. Another from Ashraf. Which category do you think describes you the best as an author? Diasporic Arab writer, exilic, immigrant or displaced, or just an Arab writer, or any other category?
Borges talked about that idea that all literature is tricks. And at the end of the day, no matter how clever your tricks are, they get discovered. My tricks are not particularly clever to begin with. So in terms of the text itself, which I don't think is exactly what Ashraf is asking about, I think he's asking about me rather than the text. But in terms of the writing, I think of it as dislocated. That's my central trick. I take things that are happening to people who don't have much of are further down on the power structure, on the global power structure, and either I make them happen to the people at the very top, or I find some way to center that and dislocate it into the world that we don't have the privilege of not caring about. So that's, in terms of the writing, that's dislocative, I think would be the word I use.
Yeah, this line of questioning seems to resonate with a number of people in it. In our chat, Najla asks, are there other authors who work on more liminal, hybrid, or uncertain perceptions of home and identity that inspire you?
There's, the short answer is yes. There's writers who are much more grounded than me in terms of their place in the world. They can point to a place and say, this is home. Home might have been bombed to all hell, but it exists as a unique location. I'm thinking here of, I haven't gotten his name wrong, Khalid Khalifa, Syrian writer. I'm pretty sure I got that right. I'm going to type it in now, so to make sure that I didn't get that name wrong. But he's the guy who wrote. Yeah, no, I was right. Khalid Khalif. He wrote one of my favorite novels of the past few years, No Knives in the Kitchens of This City, which is a book about Syria. Basically, it's about life in Syria, and it sort of spans, I think, 40 years leading up to right before the revolution, right before the Civil War. And he's wrote a more recent book called Death is Hard Work, which very much contends with the present moment, but nonetheless has this element of dislocation in the sense that, you might have not been dragged from home, or you might not have been moved around so many times for home to become a blur, but something is happening to home in a way that renders it in some way unrecognizable, right? I'm thinking of Frankenstein of Baghdad. It's one of my favorite pieces of speculative fiction. And the name of the author is going to come to me in a second. I apologize, I have a horrible memory. But basically, it's the story of Frankenstein retold in Iraq during the middle of the war. And the monster's limbs come from victims of car bombings and sectarian violence and various American-led misadventures. And that book had a profound impact on me in terms of, again, trying to find a new way to deal with something that is happening to home. I'm thinking of The Queue by Besma Abdelaziz, one of the best Kafkaesque novels since Kafka. There's a giant government ministry. This is all very clearly in post-Arab Spring Egypt, but none of it is mentioned overtly. You have to go to the ministry to get anything done. So there's a giant queue, a giant lineup of people. There's a guy with a bullet who has to prove that he's been shot before he can get the proper, And it's not only is it an incredible piece of work and an indictment of a corrupt system, but she's had to pay for that. I mean, state security is on her now. She just got her column canceled. They're pulling her new book off the shelf because it deals with the Rabaa massacre. They don't want anything on that. There's consequences to that kind of work. And so these are the writers that, for me, regardless of having a very different relationship with home, they're the ones I look to when I'm thinking about what home could be, what home shouldn't be, but is. All of the different conceptions come to me from those places.
Yeah. You're in Portland now, you're in America. Are we in America, those of us who choose to live in America or happen to live in America, are we tourists on the beach? Are we blind to the shipwreck? What does being here maybe insulate us from or disable us from understanding that is important for us to understand?
So for the Giller Prize ceremony, they fly you up to Toronto and they put me up in this incredibly swanky hotel that otherwise I would never be able to afford in a million years. Thank you to the good people of Scotiabank for paying that $800 a night. But I walk into the hotel room and there's this little packet on the counter next to the TV. It just says, personal protection kit. And I look at it and I'm like, it's weird that they would give us tasers. Like what? And I thought, no, it's just a mask, man. You've been in America too long. You can't. It's starting to really impact your worldview. I don't mind the blindness. I live so much of my life by virtue of a guy who makes stuff up for a living, by virtue of being that guy. I live so much of my life in a state of utter obliviousness. I wish that there was no shipwreck to be blind to. That's the avenue that tends to be my avenue of attack. The United States is a very loud place. And that loudness, at least in my mind, sometimes causes me to think that the things that are happening here are somehow unique to America. And most of them aren't. The one thing that America seems to do better than almost anywhere else, at least in the present moment, I'm sure throughout history there's been fine examples of this, is create a supportive neighborhood of amenities for delusion. And I think that's one of the central changes in the United States over the last 30 years. It used to be, if you believed some deranged conspiracy theory, your option was really just to go into the woods and start mailing bombs to people. And now you have an entire news network, many news networks that cater to your every whim. You have all of Facebook. If you believe that COVID contains the COVID vaccine contains a microchip, not only is there a supportive group, There's also, if you want to do yoga, you can find a Facebook group for a yoga teacher who believes the same thing. The amenities, the neighborhood has grown. Then finally, you have a whole political party, one of the two political parties in the country, Keating. That to me is the Central American nightmare, the thing it does more than any other country. So that terrifies me about the States more than any other element of its obliviousness.
Thank you, Omar. Dana, hello again, Dana.
Hi. Thank you, Omar and Sukdev. There is a lot to take away from this. You both covered a lot of interesting topics and diverse introspective strands like geographic synesthesia, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, current events and puppets, music, symbolism, cultural touchstones, your background, writing process, and more that enriched our perspectives. We at the Columbia Global Center's Amman really appreciate the illuminating conversation that you've both contributed to. A recording of this virtual book talk will be available on our website and on our social media platforms. We want to thank you both, and we want to thank everyone who sent in questions and our audience for joining us in our book talk series. Thank you.